Song, Lead Economist, Ministry of Trade and Industry. Dr. Tan's work at MTI involves the quantitative and qualitative analysis of the economic and financial conditions, as well as the prospects of sectors in the Singapore economy, and has also worked on the modeling of the impact of demographic trends on the Singapore economy. Prior to his current role, Dr. Tan was economist at the Ministry of Manpower, where he focused on evaluating the impact on policy-relevant outcomes of manpower policies, such as government-subsidized training. Dr. Tan has a PhD in economics from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Dr. Tan, please.
Hi, Basil. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Let me know when you can see them.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, thank you. Then I'll just begin. Thanks everyone for joining us today on this Saturday morning and sacrificing some of your personal time to be with us today. I really appreciate it. As has been mentioned, I hope to talk about the impact of digitalization on different sectors as well. And this really stems from my day job, which is about thinking about the impact of different events on different types of business activities. So I am an economist in the Ministry of Trade and Industry, and the views expressed in this presentation today, I just wanted to clarify, are solely on my own views, and they do not reflect those of the Ministry or the Government of Singapore. So these are the views of my own. Okay, so let's begin. And first, an icebreaker, since it's 9 a.m. and I believe some people may not have even had their breakfast. Since I'm talking about sectors, we should have some understanding of the major and minor sectors in Singapore. So maybe if we take 1 minute, can you guess the top and bottom 5 sectors in Singapore in terms of the GDP share? So if you're economic students, I believe you've learned like there are 3 ways of calculating GDP. And this way is the value-added way, which is a perspective where you see, how much additional economic value firms are bringing to the economy. So in terms of that VA share or GDP share, think of, or in your mind, try to anchor 5 top sectors and bottom sectors. And maybe I can talk for a little minute while you think about this. But why is it important to think about different sectors? Well, the reason is because, economic shocks affect sectors very differently. And you can just hark back a few years to COVID, for instance, and you realize that, there's some sectors that were devastated by COVID. Because of the border restrictions, tourism was completely shut down. And so the tourism sector was decimated for a period of time. At the same time, while people had to work from home, they started to demand more computers and electronic devices like Bluetooth headphones, like microphones, right? And this caused a huge surge in demand for electronic devices as well as semiconductor chips to power these devices. So as a result, if you look at Singapore's sectoral growth, you find that the electronics cluster in the economy surged. Well, that related to tourism tanked. And it is because of this diversity in the impact of economic shocks to sectors that I think it's important to have a sectoral lens amongst all the different lenses you have. Okay, so I'm going to review the results, and this is based on the nominal GDP share in 2023. What are the top 5 sectors? Well, they are wholesale trade, manufacturing, finance and insurance, transport and storage, information and communication, and professional services are tied 5th. So that's why I put 5-ish there. And the bottom sectors are your domestic-oriented sectors like food, beverage services, other services which include like hair salons, retail trade, and accommodation, which are hotels, as well as small goods industries. There are kind of a few things to notice on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, you notice that a lot of the sectors are externally oriented. And this speaks to the fact that Singapore is a small open economy. And really a lot of activities, demand is driven by external demand as opposed to domestic demand. Okay, before I proceed to what I think how digitalization will impact the sectors, maybe I just have one clarification on the bigger sector, wholesale trade. You might be surprised. I'm not sure whether you think of wholesale trade as being the biggest sector in Singapore, and you might think, what is this sector? What is wholesale trade? So let me explain a little bit. Wholesaling activities are basically companies that buy in bulk and then redistribute them, store them perhaps, and redistribute them using their networks. So for the wholesale trade sector, we think of them in three segments. One is the machinery, equipment, and systems segment. Those are wholesalers of electronic devices, some of which I talked about, as well as semiconductor chips. In fact, they may be the wholesaling arms of major chip manufacturers. So that's one, what we call the MES segment. The second is the fuels and chemical segment. So these are wholesalers of chemicals products as well as refined oil products. They also include oil traders in Singapore. And finally, you have your others, which are really miscellaneous wholesalers, right? And actually, 95% of wholesaling activities in Singapore are foreign wholesaling activities, right? So they do not then sell on to customers in Singapore. They're actually selling to overseas customers, right? And only 5% of them are selling to retailers and people who demand it in Singapore. Okay, this gives you a sense of the wholesaling activity. And it's big, right? And in today's talk, I'm going to focus on the sectors on the left-hand side also. You'll see that a lot of it revolves around these major sectors. Not that the domestic sectors are not important, but this talk cannot be exhaustive. So I'm going to sketch out some of the impact of digitalization of some of these major sectors in Singapore. Okay, let's see what I'm doing for time. Maybe a bit of reflection. How much digital content do we consume ourselves personally? And I think if you think about your lives, I think about my own life, I realize that I do consume a lot of digital content. So in the morning, I like to run. And after I run, I will check some of my running stats. It's a bit of a geeky thing. I check my running stats on this cloud software called Garmin Connect. Compare some of my runs to previous runs, see whether I've improved. Then I take a shower, I commute to work on the MRT, and on the MRT, I listen to podcasts because I like to take in my information audio. And I also read the news on my devices. And all these are not words printed on paper. Those are bits and reflected, converted to words on my screen. Then when I go to work, I reply emails, I create presentations, I do some coding, and those are all on digital devices. Then after work, sometimes when I relax, I like to write some reflections. And nowadays, I don't write my reflections on pen and paper. I write them on an app. And I also, if I have some time, read on my Kindle app. And you just think about this, like the sheer amount of digital content that I'm consuming and manipulating throughout the day. And you reflect on your own life, and you realize that perhaps a lot of content you're consuming, creating today, digital. I mean, this seminar is possible because of digitalization. A chart on the diagram on the right is amalgamation of different studies looking at the time people spend on different media, collected from different sources. And it shows you that, there's very strong growth on a lot of the digital content consumption. So those are consumers. How about firms? Of course, the hottest thing is going to be AI, and Prakash is going to talk a lot about that. And I'm excited to hear his views. Here's a chart on the right-hand side taken from a very recent paper published in the National Bureau of Economic Research in the US, where the authors look at AI use amongst firms in the US under the Business Trends and Outlook survey. And they found that over a 6-month period from September 2023 to March 2024, the proportion of firms that adopted AI increased from 3.9% to 5.4%, right, over a 6-month period. And it's growing very quickly, and it's expected to increase. So this is even not only consumers are consuming more digital content, firms are using more digital tools. And AI is just the tip of the iceberg, right? It's the new kid on the block. It's the hot new product. But actually, over the last decade, firms have been using more and more digital tools. So I'll give you 2 examples. One is e-commerce, right? A lot of firms are now selling some of their products and services online through e-commerce platforms. And those are digital tools that firms are using to expand their markets to consumers overseas. Another type of digital tools that firms are using is what they call SaaS, software as a service. In the olden days, what firms would do is to purchase software at one go, and it's a big investment, right, on CDs a while back. It shows my age, right? You purchase the software on CDs, and then it's like a big investment every time there's a new version, and they install those software on their computers, and then when another cycle comes out, and they do this. And that affects your cash flow, right? Because you have this very big investment, right? You have to invest in a lot of software at one go. And then and that affects your cash flow. Software as a service is basically kind of like software in the cloud, where these companies offer some of these software and capabilities for you to store your information in data centers and compute some of these functions in data centers and show you the results, right? This software can be HR software, can be invoicing software, all kinds of software. And the advantage there is, instead of having this one-off investment, you can have monthly subscriptions. So you pay monthly. That is much more friendly on firms' cash flow, as well as predictability in terms of how much they have to pay. So basically, the message I want to send on this slide is that not only consumers are consuming more digital content, and firms are using more digital tools as well. So I use the word cloud just now, cloud software, right? Cloud sounds very fluffy and very in the air, but really what is undergirding all these consumption of digital content and computation is very hard. So the diagram on the left shows you the content distribution network of Netflix in, I think, 2020, right? And all the little dots are all the ISP location, internet service provider locations of Netflix content distribution. What Netflix does is it does not store all of its content in a few data centers. But it works with local internet service providers to co-locate some of their more popular local content in local small servers, what they call edge data centers. So say you're in Singapore, right? And then the popular shows, maybe some of the Korean dramas, some of the dramas that are popular in Singapore are stored in some of these local small data centers with ISPs. And then all the other programs are stored in big data centers elsewhere. And the reason for this is the data centers, especially in urban areas like Singapore, are very expensive. Data centers require a lot of electricity. They require a lot of cooling, water for cooling. So in Singapore, where electricity is expensive, it's very expensive to maintain like large data centers. So they have smaller data centers, like edge data centers, to store popular content. And for the other contents, they are stored in more efficient locations where electricity is cheap and cooling is cheap, water is cheap. And to connect everything together, you will need all kinds of infrastructure, including undersea cable wires to transmit the data from data centers to edge data centers, as well as to wireless device, which are then channeled across wireless networks into your devices, right? All these are hardware. And indeed, right, you can see that the total data center count by 451 Research, which is a research company that specializes in collecting information from data centers, has increased and is projected to increase. This is not surprising. And notice that this piece of research, this chart on the right-hand side, is as of November 2022. And that is just around the time of the onset of the big craze about AI, right? So I believe that if they were to revise this forecast, the numbers would increase, right? The projection of the total number of data centers. Because a lot of these AIs need to be trained in major servers. What does that mean for some of these sectors in Singapore? So on the left-hand side, I show the global semiconductor market value. So what are semiconductors? They are basically etchings into semiconductor materials such as silicon that helps to do computation as well as management of data and information in digital devices. So this is by McKinsey. Again, notice the date, April 2022. So this probably doesn't include some of this AI demand. And McKinsey expects from 2021 to 2030, over around a decade, there's going to be a 7% annual growth in the market value for chips. A CAGR just refers to compound annual growth rate. That means you compound the 7% over these 9 years. On the right most bar on the chart, they show the growth contribution, which means of this growth, what are the drivers that are accounting for this growth? And you can see the major part of it is computing and data storage, which is what I was speaking about, right? You will need different types of chips to compute, to store information. And this storage may be longer term storage like NAND chips. It can be short-term data storage like RAM, right? And increasingly for AI is going to be this demand as well, computing and data storage, because you need to train your models, you need to compute, and you need a lot of high bandwidth memory. So those are a lot of RAM, random access memory, as well as NAND chips to store some of those billions of parameters you estimate in your AI. And the next highest is wireless communication, which includes the infrastructure you need to transmit all the data wirelessly through 5G networks, etc. So how does this translate to demand for sectors in Singapore? So obviously, the electronics cluster in Singapore is going to benefit because our electronics cluster consists of firms that actually manufacture chips, right? We all know major memory manufacturer Micron is located in Singapore, for instance. And then they manufacture NAND chips in Singapore. Those are long-term memory chips. But and also they are fabless firms located in Singapore. Fabless firms are firms that do not manufacture the chips, right? But they design, they construct blueprints for different types of chips for customization that different company needs for their own devices and users. So those companies will obviously benefit. So you can really start to see how this consumer demand and firm demand for digitalization and the infrastructure that's required would generate and translate to demand for chips in Singapore. But that's not all. There are two other segments I would like to highlight. One is from the manufacturing sector. So when these chip makers, they make chips, they also need equipment to make these chips. So this equipment are the most sophisticated types of precision equipment in the world, right? Because some of these chips are like 3 nanometers, right, between transistors. This means you need a lot of precision in order to manufacture them. And the machinery required to manufacture these chips also need to be very sophisticated. And these manufacturers are classified under the precision engineering cluster in our manufacturing sector as well. So not only chip manufacturers will benefit from this demand, they also demand for semiconductor equipment from the precision engineering cluster. One final segment to highlight, I talked about the MES, machine equipment and systems segment from the wholesale trade sector. Those firms will also benefit because they are wholesaling some of these chips and trading some of these chips. Besides the hard infrastructure, I talked about some of the software services, right? And the information and communication sector would also benefit from some of this digitalization. So on the right-hand side, it's a chart from the Infocom Media Development Authority of Singapore, and it shows within the information and communication sector, the subsectors that are growing the fastest. And they highlight over a period of time, 2017 to 2025. In fact, the whole sector has been growing quite quickly. But the highest growing sectors are, games, games, online services, as well as e-commerce, right? And some of these online services would be cloud services that I was talking about. Games came in a big way during COVID. There was a huge surge in demand. And e-commerce has been growing steadily over time, right? And so this is benefiting the sector as a whole. Now I want to pause here for a bit and say that so far I've sounded quite optimistic about how the digitalization will translate to demand for services and goods for sectors in Singapore. But this may not be true for all sectors. What I'm going to say is a bit more speculative, but it's I'm thinking about what negative effects it might have on some sectors. So I can think of two that I'll highlight today. The first is on the printing manufacturers, right? So these are guys that will print newspapers. They also print like flyers, etc. Increasingly, the demand for these types of flyers, physical paper flyers, are declining. People prefer to send out EDMs. And this event was sent out using an EDM. So we've seen a secular decline in the printing segment inside the manufacturing cluster in Singapore for many years. And digitalization would have contributed. Another factor to think about is the demand for retail space. Because in the past, retailers will need a physical storefront in order to sell their goods. Increasingly, they rely on online channels through e-commerce platforms, right? So this may affect the demand for retail space. Admittedly, there are some retailers that find complementaries between these two types of spaces. So they might sell their goods on site or show off their goods on site, but also have online platforms to sell goods. But still, that means that not all the sales need to be in physical locations. And that would affect the rentals of retail spaces. And we have seen weakness in the rental index of retail spaces in central areas. Okay. So far, I've talked a lot about on the demand side, right? Consumers demanding digital content, digital tools. But how about digitalization on the supply side? How do they contribute to firms' output? So IMDA has produced a very useful paper called the Singapore Digital Economy, where they try to size up some of these different parts of digitalization in Singapore economy. On the left-hand side, you see a chart that shows that they have estimated Singapore's digital economy to be 17.3%, of which 5.4% is the information and communication sector, which is what we're talking about. The vertical, the sector that's producing an output, producing the services of these digital tools. But they also have this very interesting 11.9%, which is the majority of the digital economy, which they call digitalization in the rest of the economy. What is digitalization in the rest of the economy? This is not an output perspective, this is an input perspective, which means how much are digital tools and what they call digital capital contributing to the output of goods and services in Singapore, right? So the way to think about this is like usually when you have to produce something, you have to use different types of inputs. And the two traditional types of inputs are capital and labor. Labor are just workers, and then you pay them wages, right? And then capital are things like buildings, machines, computers, software, etc. And then you have to either take a loan to invest in these capital, or you have to pay rent some of these capital, right? So the innovation here from IMDA is really to split up capital into two types, digital and non-digital. So the non-digital ones are your equipment, your buildings, etc. And the digital capital are software as well as hardware, computers, and they also try to include software services like cloud services, right? Because as we discussed, it's important input increasingly. Firms are using more cloud software. So that is that part, the digitalization. Essentially, how much is digital capital contributing to the output of different firms and sectors? So on the right-hand side, you can see the results of those. There are kind of two things to note. Number one, the sectors that are kind of using a lot of this digital capital are the major ones in Singapore economy: finance, insurance, also trade, manufacturing, crop services. You see them here. It's not surprising because they are big to begin with. So naturally, the contribution of capital too. For finance and insurance stands out. I think Sumi is going to talk a little bit about all this digital infrastructure, but they use a lot of digital capital in their production. They think about, for instance, a very fast-growing segment inside the finance and insurance sector that is payments processing players, right? Your likes of maybe digital banks or payment players like the Grab wallet, for instance. Those are a growing segment, and they are almost fully digital. They provide a lot of digital services. Even within your traditional banks, you realize that increasingly, at least for me, what I observe is that many transactions are digital in nature, right? A lot of transactions, I use my phone, I use the computer through the internet to access the services. Indeed, data centers and local data centers are very important for banks because they store the information on transactions locally. Because a lot of the transactions are digital in nature. All the information are digital in nature. So it's not surprising that they have a lot of digital capital in their production. So the second observation is that the use of digital capital in production has been increasing. You see all the sectors that are here, for the financial and insurance sector, over a 5-year period, 13.5% growth per year. So they are becoming increasingly important. So if you think about the finance insurance sector over this 5-year period, it wouldn't have grown 13.5%. Right? It would have grown, I don't have the numbers on hand, but it wouldn't have grown like this fast over this period of time. That means that the digital capital is an increasingly important and accounting for a larger share of its inputs into production. That's what it means. Okay, let me see where am I for time. I think 5 more minutes. So I end off with, so far I've looked at some of the output perspective and input perspective. Maybe I just end off with the government's role. Now, where does the government come in? We talk about the government, and in your economics textbook, we talk about government market failure, right? So what are some possible market failures? There's this nice paper that's published by MTI economists, Sarah, Jasmine, as well as IMDA analyst Jenny, looking at the impact of IMDA's SME Go Digital grants on outcomes of firms. And they postulated that there might be two types of market failures here. I mean, we already see that firms use a lot of digital capital in production, increasing amount. So what are the market failures here? They identified two. Number one is information friction. There are so many tools out there and firms are in different sectors. They may require different tools, sector-specific tools. They may require different tools in their different journey. So if you're a newbie to digital tools, you might need like some for basic functions, HR functions, transactions, etc. If you are very advanced in your journey, you might use AI, you might use data analytics tools, so different types of needs. So there's a lot of information friction there. What type of tools do I use? Second, for small and medium enterprises, some of the concerns regarding credit constraints start to kick in because they might not have a sufficient cash flow to be able to support the adoption of some of these tools. So they studied the SME Go Digital grants, and they found that actually these grants had a positive impact on firms' productivity. So this is represented on the right-hand side chart, VAPW, which stands for value added per worker. Value added is the economic activity generated per worker and divided by number of workers. So it gives you a sense of productivity, economic activity per worker in a company. And some of this analysis, obviously, they have to use econometric techniques to try to control for differences between firms that took up these grants and firms that did not, and they tried to do their best to control. And maybe one last interesting observation is that you look at the impact on total employees, right? They are still positive. So it looks like for these SME firms, maybe some starting off in their digitalization journey, even though they adopt these tools, it looks like on net they are not losing workers. At least for this subset of firms and these tools. Why might that be the case? Well, there are actually kind of two effects from digitalization that we usually think about. One is increases, say you use more digital capital, right? You may substitute from workers towards digital capital. So say what you need one less HR officer because you use this HR software. So that is for the same level of production, you need fewer workers. But at the same time, the digital capital allows you to produce more. And when you produce more, you would hire more workers as well. So there are two effects. There's a substitution effect and there's an output effect, right? So it looks like for these firms, the output effect, the fact that they can produce more as reflected in the higher revenue impact seems to have trumped any substitution effect, if there were any. But it's also possible that these workers are complements to them as well. So yeah, it looks like the government also has a role to play. There may be some market failures, especially for SMEs. So basically, this is the end of my talk, and happy to hear questions on any issues that I've raised regarding some of the output and input, and maybe basically if you were